He thought he was rescuing a tiny, helpless kitten. It was shivering, weak, and barely breathing in the box by the roadside. He wrapped it in his jacket, certain he had just saved an innocent life. But when he rushed it to the vet, everything changed. The doctor took one look and his face went pale. What this kitten really was will leave you shocked. Stay with me until the end, because this story is not what you think. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn rain drummed against the windshield as Jake Martinez drove down the winding country road. It was past 10 at night, and the headlights carved through sheets of water that seemed to come from every direction. He'd been visiting his sister upstate and was eager to get home after a long day of helping her move furniture. The radio crackled with static, and the wipers struggled against the downpour. That's when he saw it. A cardboard box sat abandoned on the shoulder, soaked through and falling apart. At first, Jake thought it was just trash someone had tossed from their car. But as his headlights swept across it, something inside moved. He slowed down, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling over. Jake grabbed his phone's flashlight and stepped into the storm. Cold rain immediately soaked through his shirt, but he barely noticed. Inside the disintegrating box, curled up on a wet towel, was the smallest kitten he'd ever seen. Its fur was matted and dark with moisture, its tiny body trembling violently. The little creature's eyes were barely open, and its breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. "Oh no, no, no," Jake whispered, his heart breaking at the sight. "Who would do this to you?" Without hesitation, he scooped the fragile bundle into his hands. The kitten was so light it felt like holding air, and its skin was ice cold to the touch. Jake quickly unzipped his jacket and tucked the tiny creature against his chest, trying to share his body heat. "It's okay, little one," he said softly, rushing back to his truck. "I've got you now." The drive to town felt endless. Jake kept one hand pressed gently against his chest, feeling for the faint flutter of the kitten's heartbeat. Every few minutes, he'd whisper words of encouragement, as if his voice alone could keep the tiny life from slipping away. "Just hold on," he pleaded. "We're almost there." Jake had always been a cat person. Growing up, his family had rescued dozens of strays, and he'd learned to spot the signs of abandonment and neglect. But this was different. This kitten looked barely days old, far too young to survive on its own. The thought of someone deliberately leaving it in that box made his stomach turn. When he finally reached his apartment, Jake's hands shook as he unlocked the door. He flicked on every light, suddenly desperate to see the full extent of the kitten's condition. Under the bright kitchen lighting, his heart sank further. The little creature was even smaller than he'd realized, no bigger than his palm. Its fur, what little there was of it, seemed oddly coarse and darker than most newborn kittens. But what struck him most were its eyes. They were larger than normal, almost disproportionate to its tiny head, and they held an intensity that seemed strange for something so young. Jake quickly prepared a makeshift nest from towels and positioned a heating pad underneath on the lowest setting. He'd done this before with rescued kittens, but never with one quite this fragile. The little one barely responded when he placed it in the warm nest, just a faint mewling sound that was more breath than voice. "Stay with me," Jake whispered, gently stroking its head with his fingertip. He spent the night on the couch beside the makeshift bed, checking on the kitten every few minutes. Sometimes it would shift slightly or make that barely audible cry, and Jake would exhale with relief. But as the hours passed, he grew more worried. The kitten wouldn't take the warmed milk he offered, and its breathing remained labored. By morning, Jake knew he was in over his head. He'd saved plenty of strays before, but this one needed professional help. He carefully lifted the tiny creature, surprised again by how light it felt, and placed it in a small carrier lined with soft blankets. The veterinary clinic was just opening when Jake arrived, practically running through the front door with the carrier clutched against his chest. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up from her computer. I need help, Jake said breathlessly. I found this kitten abandoned on the road last night. It's barely alive. The receptionist's expression shifted from routine politeness to genuine concern as Jake opened the carrier. She leaned forward, her eyes widening slightly. "Oh my," she murmured. "Let me get Dr. Morrison right away." Within minutes, a tall man in his 50s emerged from the back rooms. Dr. Morrison had been practicing veterinary medicine for over 20 years, and his reputation for saving difficult cases was well known throughout the county. But when he looked into the carrier, something flickered across his weathered features. "Bring him back immediately," the doctor said, his voice carrying an urgency that made Jake's pulse quicken. In the examination room, Dr. Morrison carefully lifted the tiny creature onto the metal table. Under the bright lights, every detail became starkly visible. The kitten's unusual proportions, the strange texture of its fur, the way its oversized ears seemed to dwarf its small head. Jake watched anxiously as the veterinarian began his examination, expecting routine checks for temperature, dehydration, and basic vital signs. But Dr. Morrison's movements became increasingly deliberate, almost cautious. He examined the kitten's paws with particular attention, studying the shape and size of what Jake assumed were normal kitten claws. "Where exactly did you find this?" Dr. Morrison asked, his voice strangely quiet. "On Route 47, about 10 miles outside town," Jake replied. "Someone just left it in a cardboard box in the rain. Can you believe that?" The doctor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gently turned the kitten over, examining its belly and the formation of its tail. His brow furrowed deeper with each passing second. He reached for a magnifying glass, studying markings on the creature's face that Jake hadn't even noticed. The silence in the room grew heavy. Jake shifted uncomfortably, watching as the color slowly drained from Dr. Morrison's face. The veterinarian's hands, usually steady and confident, began to tremble slightly as he continued his examination. "Doctor?" Jake ventured. "Is everything okay? I mean, I know it's in bad shape, but you can help it, right?" Dr. Morrison straightened slowly, removing his glasses and cleaning them with shaking hands. When he looked at Jake, his expression was a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like fear. "Mr. Martinez," he said carefully, "I need to ask you some very important questions, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as Dr. Morrison's words hung in the air. The examination room suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher, casting sharp shadows across the veterinarian's pale face. "What kind of questions?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Morrison set down his magnifying glass with trembling fingers. He glanced toward the door, then back at the tiny creature lying motionless on the examination table. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Jake's stomach clench. "Did you see any other animals in the area? Any signs of adult cats nearby? Tracks in the mud, perhaps?" Jake shook his head slowly. "No, nothing like that. Just the box. Why are you asking me this?" The doctor moved closer to the table, pointing at markings Jake hadn't noticed before. Under the bright examination lights, he could see faint stripes along the creature's sides, patterns that seemed too defined, too wild for a domestic kitten. "These markings," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "and the bone structure, the ear placement, the facial features." He paused, swallowing hard. "Mr. Martinez, what you brought me isn't a house cat." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He stared down at the tiny, helpless creature he'd cradled against his chest all night. Its oversized ears twitched slightly, and those disproportionately large eyes seemed to focus on him with an intelligence that suddenly felt unsettling. "What do you mean it's not a house cat?" Jake's voice cracked. "Of course it is. Look at it. It's tiny. It was abandoned. It needs help." Dr. Morrison reached for a thick reference book from the counter, his movements deliberate but shaky. He flipped through pages of photographs and diagrams, stopping at a section that made Jake's blood run cold. The images showed various wild cat species in their juvenile stages. Based on the cranial structure, the limb proportions, and these distinctive markings, the veterinarian said, pointing between the book and the creature on the table, I believe what you've rescued is a wild cat cub, possibly a bobcat, though there are other possibilities that are far more concerning. Jake's legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of the examination table, staring at the tiny creature that had seemed so helpless just moments before. That's impossible. Bobcats don't just appear on roadsides, and it's so small, so defenseless. That's exactly what makes this so dangerous, Dr. Morrison replied, his voice growing more urgent. Wild cat cubs are born helpless, just like domestic kittens, but they grow fast, and their instincts are completely different. What seems like a sweet, needy kitten today could become a serious threat in just a few weeks. The tiny creature on the table let out a soft, mewling sound, the same pitiful cry that had tugged at Jake's heartstrings all night. But now, with the doctor's words echoing in his mind, even that innocent sound took on a different quality. Dr. Morrison continued flipping through the reference book, stopping at a page that made him curse under his breath. There's something else, he said grimly. These markings, the coloration pattern, it's not consistent with native bobcat populations in this region. Jake felt the room spinning slightly. What are you saying? Well, I'm saying this cub might not even be from around here. There's a growing problem with illegal exotic pet trade. People buy wild animals as babies, thinking they'll make interesting pets. When they realize what they've gotten themselves into, they abandon them. The implications crashed over Jake like cold water. He thought about the cardboard box, the remote location, the way the cub had been left with just a wet towel. Someone had deliberately placed it there, knowing it would likely die. So someone bought this as a pet and then just dumped it when it became inconvenient. Jake's anger flared, temporarily overriding his shock. Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. It happens more often than you'd think. Exotic cat cubs are cute and manageable for a few weeks. Then they start showing their wild nature. They don't bond like domestic cats. They have specific dietary needs, and they can become aggressive without warning. Jake stared down at the tiny creature, trying to reconcile this new information with the helpless bundle he'd held against his chest. But it's so young, so vulnerable. How could it hurt anyone? That's the deceptive part, the veterinarian explained, putting on a fresh pair of gloves. Right now, yes, it's completely dependent on care, but wild cats develop much faster than domestic ones. Those claws you see, in 2 weeks, they'll be razor sharp. Those teeth, they're designed for hunting, not playing with yarn. As if on cue, the cub stretched one tiny paw, and Jake noticed for the first time that its claws seemed unusually long and curved for such a small creature. What he'd assumed were normal kitten features suddenly looked predatory under the harsh examination lights. Dr. Morrison carefully lifted the cub again, examining its hind legs. See the muscle development here? Even malnourished and weak, you can see the bone density that's characteristic of wild species. This isn't built like a domestic cat. Jake's mind raced back through the night. The way the cub had gripped his shirt with surprising strength. How its eyes had seemed to track movement even when it appeared nearly unconscious. Signs he'd dismissed as fighting spirit now took on an entirely different meaning. What happens now? Jake asked, his voice hollow. The veterinarian set the cub back down gently, his expression grave. First, we need to determine exactly what species this is. That will tell us about its needs, its potential danger level, and what kind of specialized care it requires. He moved to a cabinet and pulled out several vials and testing kits. I'll need to take some samples for genetic testing. But Jake, I have to be honest with you. Even if we can identify the species and provide appropriate care, this animal can never be a pet. The words hit harder than Jake expected. He'd already started imagining nursing the tiny creature back to health, watching it grow strong and playful in his apartment. The bond he'd felt forming during that long night suddenly felt naive and dangerous. "What about wildlife rehabilitation?" Jake asked desperately. "Surely there are people who specialize in this kind of thing." Dr. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "There are facilities, yes, but they're rare, expensive, and have strict requirements. And that's assuming this cub can even survive. Wild animals have specific nutritional needs that are difficult to meet, especially at this age." As if sensing the gravity of the conversation, the tiny creature stirred weakly, those oversized eyes opening to fix on Jake's face. For a moment, he saw the same helpless plea that had compelled him to stop on that rainy road. But now he also saw something else lurking behind that gaze, something wild and untamable that no amount of human kindness could change. The examination room fell silent, except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the barely audible breathing of the creature that had turned Jake's world upside down in the span of a single night. Dr. Morrison moved to his desk and pulled out a thick manila folder, his movements deliberate but tense. Jake watched as the veterinarian's hands continued to shake slightly while he flipped through official-looking documents and photographs. "There's something else I need to show you," Dr. Morrison said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. 3 weeks ago, the State Wildlife Department issued an alert to all veterinary clinics in the region. He pulled out a bulletin with bold red lettering across the top. Jake couldn't make out all the details from where he stood, but he caught fragments of words that made his blood run cold. Dangerous. Escaped. Public safety warning. "What kind of alert?" Jake asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Dr. Morrison hesitated, glancing toward the door again, as if checking to make sure they were alone. There was a break-in at an exotic animal facility about 60 miles from here. Several animals were reported missing, including juvenile wildcats. The room seemed to grow colder. Jake felt his knees weaken as the implications sank in. "You think this could be one of the missing animals?" "The timing fits," the doctor replied grimly. "The break-in happened exactly 3 weeks ago. This cub appears to be roughly that age, maybe a little older, and the location where you found it, it's along one of the main routes someone would take fleeing from that facility." Jake stared down at the tiny creature, which had curled into a tight ball on the warming pad. Its breathing was still shallow, but something about its posture seemed different now, more alert, despite its obvious weakness. But why would someone steal baby animals just to abandon them? Jake's voice carried a note of desperation. He wanted there to be some logical explanation that didn't involve the dangerous scenarios forming in his mind. Dr. Morrison closed the folder and leaned against the counter, his expression grave. "There are several possibilities, none of them good. Sometimes thieves steal exotic animals thinking they can sell them on the black market. When they realize how difficult and illegal it is, they panic and dump them." He paused, studying Jake's face carefully. "But there's another possibility that's even worse. Some people steal these animals specifically to raise them as attack animals or status symbols. When they become too difficult to handle, they abandon them in remote areas." The tiny cub shifted on the table, letting out a sound that was slightly different from before. Less of a mew and more of a low rumble that seemed to vibrate from deep in its chest. Jake had never heard a domestic kitten make a sound quite like that. "Did you hear that?" Dr. Morrison asked sharply, moving closer to the examination table. Jake nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "What was it?" Wildcats vocalize differently than domestic ones. Even as cubs, they have a wider range of sounds, many of which domestic cats simply can't produce. The veterinarian carefully lifted the cub again, examining its throat and jaw structure under the light. As he did, the creature's eyes snapped open, fixing on the doctor with an intensity that was startling. For just a moment, Jake saw something flicker behind those oversized pupils, something that looked almost like recognition or calculation. "Dr. Morrison," Jake said slowly, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" The veterinarian set the cub down gently, but kept his hands positioned defensively, as if ready to pull away quickly. "Based on the bone structure, the muscle development, and these vocalizations, I'm becoming increasingly certain this isn't just any wild cat species. He moved to his computer and pulled up a database of exotic animals. Photos flashed across the screen, each more intimidating than the last. Jake saw images of adult wild cats that looked nothing like the domestic breeds he was familiar with. Powerful shoulders, massive paws, eyes that seemed to burn with predatory intelligence. The facial structure is all wrong for a bobcat, Dr. Morrison continued, clicking through more images. The proportions suggest something larger, more aggressive. Jake felt sick. How much larger? Depending on the species, we could be looking at an animal that will weigh anywhere from 40 to over 100 pounds when fully grown, with claws designed to take down prey much larger than themselves. The cub on the table stretched again, and this time Jake noticed how its tiny paws spread wide, revealing claws that seemed disproportionately long and sharp for such a small creature. What he'd interpreted as desperate clinging the night before now looked more like the instinctive grip of a natural predator. Dr. Morrison pulled up a particular image that made them both freeze. It showed a sleek, powerful wild cat with distinctive markings along its sides. The same markings Jake could now clearly see on the tiny creature before them. "This," the doctor said quietly, "is what I think we're dealing with." Jake read the caption beneath the photo, and his heart nearly stopped. The species name was followed by words that made his blood run cold. Highly dangerous, illegal to own, extremely aggressive territorial behavior. "That can't be right," Jake whispered. "Look at it. It's barely alive. It needed help." "That's exactly what makes this so terrifying," Dr. Morrison replied, his voice steady but strained. "Right now, yes, it's helpless. But this species develops rapidly. Within weeks, those cute little mews will become growls that can be heard from a mile away. Those tiny claws will be capable of shredding through leather." As if responding to their conversation, the cub lifted its head and fixed both men with a stare that was unsettlingly direct. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the creature seemed to be listening, processing their words with an intelligence that went far beyond what he'd expect from a newborn kitten. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison said, lowering his voice even further. "This species doesn't just grow physically aggressive. They're incredibly intelligent, capable of complex problem-solving and long-term planning. Even as juveniles, they can be manipulative." Jake laughed nervously. "Manipulative? It's barely 3 weeks old. Wild predators are born with instincts that take domestic animals years to develop, if they ever do at all. This cub already knows how to appear helpless when it needs care, how to make sounds that trigger human protective instincts." The words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He thought about the way the cub had looked at him on that rainy road, the pitiful sounds it had made that compelled him to stop. Had those been genuine cries for help? Or something more calculated? Dr. Morrison moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a small tranquilizer gun. "I'm going to sedate it so we can get more detailed measurements and take the samples we need for genetic testing. But Jake, I need you to understand something very clearly." He turned to face Jake directly, his expression more serious than anything Jake had ever seen. "If this is what I think it is, we're not just dealing with a wild animal. We're dealing with one of the most dangerous predators on the continent. And right now, it's imprinted on you." "Oh, imprinted?" Jake's voice cracked. "You were the first thing it saw when it was rescued. You fed it, kept it warm, carried it against your body for hours. In its mind, you're now part of its pack structure. That might seem sweet now, but as it grows larger and stronger, that bond could become extremely dangerous." The cub on the table turned its head toward Jake at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, Jake could swear he saw something almost possessive in its gaze, something that suggested it had no intention of letting him go. Dr. Morrison prepared the tranquilizer, his movements careful and precise. "Once I sedate it, we'll have maybe an hour to get all the information we need before it wakes up. After that, we'll need to make some very difficult decisions about what happens next." Jake stared at the tiny creature, that had seemed so helpless just hours before. Now, knowing what it might become, every small movement took on a sinister quality. The way it tracked their movements, the calculating look in its oversized eyes, the almost predatory grace with which it shifted position despite its apparent weakness. "What kind of decisions?" Jake asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Dr. Morrison met his gaze steadily, the kind that might save lives, including yours. The tranquilizer dart found its mark with surgical precision. Within seconds, the tiny creature's eyes grew heavy, its breathing slowing to an even more shallow rhythm. Dr. Morrison worked quickly, his hands steady despite the gravity of what they were uncovering. "Help me position it under the light," he instructed Jake, his voice clinical but tense. As they moved the sedated cub, Jake noticed details that had escaped him in the darkness of the previous night. The creature's hind legs were disproportionately muscular for its size, built for explosive power rather than the clumsy wobbling of domestic kittens. Its tail, which he'd assumed was just unusually thick, now revealed itself to be heavily muscled at the base. Dr. Morrison pulled out a set of calipers, measuring the skull width and length with meticulous care. Each measurement made him pause, double-checking his numbers against a chart on his desk. His frown deepened with every calculation. "The cranial capacity is enormous for this body size," he muttered, more to himself than to Jake. "Intelligence levels in this species are off the charts compared to domestic cats." Jake watched as the veterinarian photographed distinctive markings he'd missed entirely. Under the bright lights, what had appeared to be random dark patches revealed themselves as intricate patterns, rosettes and stripes that seemed to follow a genetic blueprint far removed from any house cat Jake had ever seen. "These markings," Dr. Morrison said, pointing to spots along the cub's flanks, "they're not just camouflage. They're territorial markers. Even as adults, members of this species can identify individuals by these patterns from incredible distances." The doctor moved to examine the creature's paws more closely, gently extending its claws under the magnifying glass. What emerged made both men step back involuntarily. Even retracted, the claws were nearly twice the length of what Jake had observed, curved and razor-sharp with a hook-like design, clearly meant for gripping and tearing. "Those aren't climbing claws," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "Those are killing claws." Jake felt his world shifting beneath his feet. Every maternal instinct that had driven him to rescue this creature now felt naive and dangerous. But it was so helpless, it couldn't even lift its head. "That's the most disturbing part," the veterinarian replied, drawing a blood sample with practiced efficiency. "This species is known for something called tactical helplessness. They instinctively know when to appear vulnerable to manipulate larger animals into providing care." The words hit Jake like ice water. He remembered how the cub had seemed to focus on his face even when appearing nearly unconscious, how it had made just the right sounds to tug at his heartstrings, how it had gripped his shirt with surprising strength while simultaneously seeming too weak to move. Dr. Morrison labeled the blood samples and moved to his computer, pulling up files that made Jake's stomach clench. "I'm cross-referencing with the missing animal reports now," he said, clicking through databases with increasing urgency. The screen filled with photographs and detailed descriptions. Jake saw images of facilities with reinforced cages, warning signs posted every few feet, handlers wearing protective gear that looked more suited for bomb disposal than animal care. "Here," Dr. Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Facility break-in, March 15th. 6 juvenile specimens reported missing." He scrolled down to a list that made Jake's blood run cold. The species names read like a catalog of humanity's worst nightmares. Predators that had no business existing outside of maximum security wildlife facilities. Animals whose very presence in populated areas triggered federal emergency protocols. "One of the missing animals matches the estimated age and markings of what you found," Dr. Morrison continued, his finger hovering over a particular entry. "If this is correct, we're dealing with something that shouldn't exist within 500 miles of any human settlement." Jake stared at the screen, trying to process information that seemed to belong in a nightmare rather than reality. What does that mean for me? For my safety? The veterinarian turned away from the computer, his face grave. It means that every hour you spent with this animal, every moment it was learning your scent, your voice, your habits, you were unknowingly forming a bond that could become deadly. The sedated cub stirred slightly on the table, its breathing pattern shifting. Even unconscious, there was something unsettling about its posture. It didn't look like a sleeping kitten. It looked like a predator conserving energy. The facility reports indicate that this particular species forms intense attachments to their first human contact. Dr. Morrison explained, checking his watch nervously. In the wild, they imprint on their mothers and become extremely territorial about protecting that relationship. If this cub has imprinted on you, he didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood the implication. The tiny creature he'd cradled against his chest all night wasn't just a wild animal. It was a potential stalker, a predator that would grow larger and more dangerous while maintaining an obsessive focus on the human who had first shown it kindness. How long before it wakes up? Jake asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Maybe 20 minutes, Dr. Morrison replied, moving to a secure communication device. I need to contact the State Wildlife Emergency Response Team. They'll want to take custody immediately. Jake felt a strange pang of loss, despite everything he'd learned. The memory of the tiny creature's warmth against his chest, the way it had seemed to trust him completely, still tugged at something deep in his protective instincts. What will happen to it? Dr. Morrison paused in his dialing, meeting Jake's eyes with a mixture of sympathy and steel resolve. That depends on the genetic testing results and the assessment team. But Jake, you need to understand something. This isn't a rehabilitation case. This is a containment situation. The words hung heavy in the air as the veterinarian completed his call. Jake listened to fragments of urgent conversation, catching phrases like code red biological threat and immediate extraction protocol. The reality of what he'd stumbled into was becoming clearer and more terrifying with each passing minute. On the examination table, the sedated cub's ears twitched slightly. Even unconscious, it seemed to be tracking the sound of Jake's voice. Dr. Morrison noticed the movement and quickly checked the animal's responsiveness levels. It's fighting the sedation, he said with growing alarm. This species metabolizes drugs faster than domestic animals. We might have less time than I thought. Jake watched as the creature's eyes began to flutter, fighting against the chemical restraints. When they opened, even partially, they fixed immediately on Jake's face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. There was recognition there, and something else. Something that looked disturbingly like possessive satisfaction. The tiny predator had found its human, and it had no intention of letting go. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the morning air. The Wildlife Emergency Response Team was coming, and Jake's life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes with a creature that was waking up far sooner than anyone had planned. Dr. Morrison reached for the tranquilizer gun again, his hands moving with practiced urgency. Jake, I need you to step back. Now. The cub's eyes opened fully, locking onto Jake with predatory focus. And for the first time since he'd found it, Jake saw the creature for what it truly was. Not a helpless kitten needing rescue, but an apex predator that had just claimed its first human. The sirens grew louder, but Jake realized with growing horror that help might not arrive in time. Jake's story serves as a chilling reminder that not everything is as it appears. What seemed like a simple act of kindness on that rainy night turned into a terrifying encounter with one of nature's most dangerous predators. The tiny creature he thought he was saving had actually been assessing him from the very beginning, using instincts millions of years old to secure its survival. The Wildlife Emergency Team did arrive in time, and the cub was safely contained. Jake learned later that it was indeed one of the missing animals from the facility break-in. a species so dangerous that its very existence near populated areas triggers federal protocols. He was lucky. The imprinting process was still in its early stages, and no permanent psychological damage occurred. But Jake will never forget those calculating eyes, or the way the creature tracked his every movement even while appearing helpless. It changed his perspective forever about the thin line between compassion and naivety, between helping and enabling something that could become deadly. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that know exactly how to make us want to help them. Next time you see an animal in distress, remember Jake's story. Your kindness might be exactly what a predator is counting on.